typing this. So there it goes. So again, welcome in everybody. If you have any questions throughout this workshop, feel free to type them into the chat and we will answer them as appropriate, but we'll probably just ask to hold all questions till the end. And without further ado, I'm going to pass it on over to Dr. Souther. So thank you again for joining us.
Thanks very much for the introduction, and I'm going to be sharing my screen, if you'll bear with me. Nice to see some familiar names. Oh, and I'm on the wrong slide. Here we are. So tonight, what I'd like to do is spend just a little bit of time giving you a quick introduction to doing oral history. This is pitched for the beginner, but also there should be some tips, I think, maybe for people who are familiar with or have done oral histories in the past. Hopefully there will be some techniques or other things that I share that are also pertinent if you do have some oral history experience. And of course, as Allison said at the end, I'm happy to take questions and can certainly talk in more detail about some of these things if you do have more experience. With that said, I wanted to begin by just asking the very basic question, why oral history, or why do oral history? Many historians over the years, I think, have disdained oral history, and thankfully over time that has changed. It's not just something that we use because we're doing a doctoral dissertation or a book and we need a certain set of facts to fill in some gaps. It's really something more than just documenting facts. It's more about capturing lived experiences, feelings or perceptions about places and people and experiences in the past. And it's very personal. It's one person's perspective, not something that's much broader necessarily. But I think you could see that if you collected a lot of oral histories, over time, you might be able to look at all the different things that you glean from different ones, and you might begin to come to some sort of better sense of how multiple people tended to view particular events in the past. I think this is an especially good technique for thinking about how you document your own family's history. This is something that not enough people give attention to. I think people think about doing it and then they just never get around to it because they maybe don't know how best to do it well. And it seems daunting. And so they end up saying, well, someday I'd like to, and then someday never comes. So it really can add a new dimension to genealogy. I think many people are familiar with using ancestry.com or other similar services and get fixated on using documents. Those are really important, but what those often leave out is the sort of the lore of one's family. And sometimes those things are true and sometimes they're, crafted a little bit, yes, but they are nonetheless important perspectives on how people see their past. And so I think they're important. Oral history can thirdly foster community building and give voice to marginalized people and ideas. So it may be more than just an interest in documenting your own family and their history. It's an opportunity potentially for you to think about, could we document the history of our street or our block club or our garden club or some other organization? Could we cross divides in our community by inviting people of diverse backgrounds to come together and talk about what matters to them and what their experience in this community is? So I think you could see a lot of ways that you could use oral history to bring together people who might not otherwise come together. Next, it's really also a dialogue, but I would caution that it's not a conversation. Oral history methodology is very particular about having a defined role for the interviewer and the participant or informant or interviewee, the narrator. There are a number of different terms that are used for that other person. And It embodies really at its best what the oral historian Michael Frisch at the University at Buffalo termed a shared authority, because really you're coming together, two people are coming together and they are co-creating a history. And yes, it's really about one person's recollections, but it takes two really to make it happen. It takes a skillful set of questions and good listening skills, and it also takes the other person's ability to take that and then do something and make it useful and illuminating. And finally, it's really more than a tape in the drawer. Yes, we don't use cassette tapes anymore, generally speaking. We use digital media, but the same idea is true whether it be a digital file or an old cassette tape. An oral history should not just be relegated to a desk drawer or a desktop on your computer. It's something that ideally can be shared more broadly. So you really could support public-facing digital exhibits, podcasts, other projects. It could be part of a radio program, documentary. There's so many things you can do with oral history besides just set it aside and forget about it. As you might expect when you're creating something, everything you create is property in a way. Now, I'm not an attorney, but really you're creating property of a sort. And so you own you own your recorded voice, and the person you're interviewing owns their recorded voice. So who owns the recording? Well, if no one does anything after an oral history, that recording technically belongs to you and to the person you interview. Now, you can probably imagine that that could create some issues if you told the person you were recording this for one purpose, and then later you decided you wanted to do something else with it. That would be a real problem. And if you didn't spell that out and you didn't take into consideration that you need a way to transfer certain rights and responsibilities for that recording, you would have a problem. So, so copyright is something that you have to think about from the outset. And I would argue that it's not really something that applies only if you're doing a formal oral history project. I really think that even if you're interviewing a family member, you should see this as an opportunity to possibly share this with a broader public. And if you have that intent, you need to think about copyright, even though you say, well, Aunt Susie's not going to care, but technically Aunt Susie, might care, and you can't presume who does and doesn't care. You also should think about preservation. Why should we care about preservation of an oral history? And how can you ensure preservation? Basically, one good way of doing that is to think about being a good steward of digital media. So we don't have a cassette tape anymore, but we have digital files. And as you can imagine, those could be misplaced. If there's only one copy and you lose it, or the file gets corrupted, that would be a real problem. So it's good to think about having more than one copy available. And ideally, one copy maybe is on your computer, maybe another is on an external hard drive, and you hopefully have it in the cloud on some service like Dropbox or some other place. And ideally, even beyond that, maybe you deposit it in a library's collection where there are professionals whose job it is to maintain media. Access goes closely with preservation. So how can you make the interview available and on what terms? That's something that can be done in conversation with a librarian or archivist. We have a collection at Cleveland State University called the Cleveland Regional Oral History Collection, and the library at CSU helps us with that. And so we have a certain set of guidelines and policies that we follow and that we can share with those who would like to deposit their interviews into that collection, knowing that they would be widely available to anyone in the world to listen to, enjoy, use, etc. Informed consent is also really important. It is basically what it suggests in the very name. It is informing someone and gaining their consent to be interviewed and to have that material shared on terms that are clear to and fair to them. So you actually have responsibilities to those that you record. And those are things that need to be spelled out in writing and also shared verbally with them in advance. It's especially important, I think, if you're not interviewing Aunt Susie, you're interviewing someone who's maybe not in your family. You really do want to build trust, and you want them to feel that they can, place some faith in you to be a good steward for the interview. I could say a lot more about that, but we'll save that for the Q&A. I mentioned Creative Commons in this slide only to suggest that there is something called Creative Commons. If you're not familiar with it, there are different licenses basically that can be applied to all types of intellectual property, including oral histories. And there's so many different permutations of this that we can't really get into those details, but we can say that there's an opportunity, for example, to attribute the source when someone uses a material like an oral history. So, who is this by? And on what terms am I sharing it? And can someone, do this for commercial purposes, or is it only for non-commercial? There are various things that you can apply with Creative Commons that it's just a shorthand for here's what you can and can't do with this material. We use at Cleveland State for the projects that I mentioned, we use a release form. And I would recommend that, I think in the best case, you decide that you'd like to do oral history. If it's in the Cleveland area, you may decide that you want to work with us and you'd like to deposit the oral histories you collect with the Cleveland Regional Oral History Collection. If you do, we have a form that you can use for that, for you to sign and also for the person you interview to sign. It spells out all the different things that could be done with the interview. It doesn't say that those things will necessarily always happen, but those things could happen. And so it gives someone a sense of really what they're doing before they actually sit down to be interviewed. They know what the terms are and whether they're comfortable with them. If you don't use this kind of term or form, I would encourage you to develop one of your own and think beyond your specific use. Try to think about what people after you might want to do with that. Try to come up with language that enables others to use this material in the future. And I think that you could go to any oral history program around the country, including us, and get some advice for how to craft such a document to make it useful to you. Technology is another important consideration. I'm starting out with something that's much more complex than what I would expect the typical person who's trying this out for the first time would do. We use a setup that these days costs about $350. But what I want to suggest really strongly is that you don't need necessarily a particular kind of setup to do a pretty good or a very good job. A lot of it is in how you use whatever equipment you use rather than what equipment you choose. So we're using a very particular type of microphone called a cardioid mic, which captures best the sound in a sort of a balloon shape around the microphone. So it's not something that picks up as well off to the sides or elsewhere in the room. It's really focused on the person speaking. So that's one of a number of different types of microphones. And if you were wanting to do something in I don't know, the Cleveland Cultural Gardens, and you'd like the sounds of birds chirping to suggest nature, excuse me, then you could do better with a different kind of microphone. So there are different types of mics, and they're not all well suited to doing a typical oral history interview. You can do this connecting a device such as this to your phone or to your tablet, but you don't necessarily have to have a dedicated microphone. It's ideal, but it's not absolutely required. The most basic setup that I could recommend would be to, assuming you have a smartphone, to get a simple tripod or stand that will hold the phone. And what you're really trying to do more than anything is you're trying to capture the voice of the person you're interviewing. Your own voice should be audible, but your own voice is not as critical as the person who's narrating. Presumably, their voice is more important because they're the storyteller. You're the elicitor of stories, but they're actually telling the stories. So you want whatever you're using to be placed closer to them than to you. And it helps if you're going to be using just a phone without a connected mic to know where your phone has its microphone. So there are always little holes basically where the sound either comes out or where it collects sound on a phone. They're typically at the bottom of a phone, but they do vary. So it helps to just take a good look at your phone. And if you're not sure, read about what kind of phone you have and where is its microphone. That's what you want pointed toward the person you're interviewing. So you would use either an iPhone or an Android, and you would want to have an app for voice recording. Most phones have a built-in voice recorder app, but it may not be the optimal one for doing oral histories because the user interface is not always as appealing. I like the Rev app, REV. That's my favorite one to use when I'm not actually using our own specific setup. I would probably choose Rev as a standalone app. It actually has an optional paid transcription service. I don't use that, but one could use this. I would put it on a tripod, or if you don't want to invest $15 or $20 for a tripod, if you're doing this one time and you want to improvise, all you need is something like a stack of books. You basically just want to get that microphone as close to mouth level as possible, not too far below. You could probably get about half a dozen thick books, place them in front of the person, and just ask them not to touch them. Don't touch the phone or the books, and you'll do pretty well as long as that microphone is pointed toward their mouth. If you do it the opposite way, it's not going to work. Whenever you're using a mobile device, one thing that's really important to keep in mind is that if you get a lot of texts or phone calls, that's not a good thing. So you need to make sure you remember to put your phone on airplane mode. That'll also save your battery. So I recommend having a fully charged battery. Don't forget to put it on airplane mode so that there are no interruptions. And then place that microphone as well as you know how to place it, which is going to be about 3 to 5 inches from the person's mouth, ideally. If you move farther away, the quality is going to begin to go downhill. So capturing great sound really is a function of a number of different considerations, but it may surprise you that the quality of the microphone is not the most important thing. You can spend any amount of money on a microphone, and the ones that we typically use are a couple hundred or a few $100s each, but you don't necessarily have to have something so pricey. So the quality of the microphone is somewhat important. More important than that is the setting of the interview. It's good to have a quiet, controlled setting. I always ask people if they have do they have animals? Do they have a dog that barks, for example? Is there a way to do this interview where a pet won't interrupt? Maybe they can have someone take their dog for a long walk while they do the interview, for example. You could also try to do an interview in a library conference room that you reserve in advance. That's another that's a good idea for another reason as well, because if you don't know the person well, this is a nice neutral but also quiet, controlled setting where you'll both feel comfortable coming together, but you'll also not be interrupted by noises, hopefully. More important still, and the most important thing of all, is the placement of the microphone, as I had said before. That's critically important because no matter what type of microphone it is, the farther it is from the source, logically, the worse it's going to do at capturing what you're really trying to record, which is voice. Incidentally, this also applies to phone interviews. Those will not turn out well if the person on the other end puts their phone on speakerphone mode and sets it on the table for an hour. You're going to get a lot of room sound, and it's going to sound kind of tinny and not at all like the quality that you'd expect to hear if you turned on your favorite radio station or podcast. So if you're doing telephone interviews, which of course a lot of people started to do more during the pandemic, you could do this in any number of ways, really, but I would recommend Google Voice. It's a pretty simple way of doing a good recording, as long as no one gets on speakerphone. Once again, that's a real no-no. So all you need for this is, well, a phone, yes. Having a smartphone is sort of a must. And you really want something like I'm using. It doesn't have to be wireless, but you could use either AirPods or wired earbuds, or a headset of some sort. Whatever you use just needs to have a built-in microphone so that it's able to really capture your voice. And you need a free Google account. Most people these days tend to have a Google account. So if you have one, you can go ahead and set up a Google Voice number. It will connect that number to whatever number you give it. So you may give it your cell phone number and it'll connect those. The person you're interviewing can be on any kind of phone. They could be on a landline with a cord for that matter, but they're going to need to make sure that they don't go into speakerphone. If their phone has that mode, you don't want them to do that. They ideally will have the same kind of setup you have, and they'll be using it, so they don't have to hold the phone in their hand. To do such an interview with Google Voice, it's pretty simple. And there are a few other things that I could share, but the most important thing is that's not very intuitive, is that you have to give the interviewee your number, because to record using Google Voice, they have to call you. You cannot call them and then record them. It's just set up that way. So give them your Google Voice number and arrange a time for the interview to occur. And then at that appointed time, they call you and they'll be prompted to give their name. And then when you pick up the phone, you'll see that you have a call from Aunt Susie. And so as soon as that happens, you can say, hi, and I'm going to begin recording. You tap 4 on your phone and you'll both hear a little voice that says, now recording. I always inform the interviewee that we're now being recorded, just to state the obvious and say, is that okay with you? And they'll hopefully say yes. And that's their consent on the record for that call to be recorded. And so then you just do your interview. When you're done, you both hang up, and you'll then go back to Google Voice, to your account, and you'll look under voicemails, and there you'll find the recording, which you can download. And at that point, just as if you were using a digital recorder or any other setup, you would want to rename your file so that you know it's Aunt Susie, and you do something with that recording. You make your backups, you put it in the cloud, you do all the things for safekeeping so that you don't misplace or accidentally erase that file. So turning now, I'd like to spend the rest of my comments focus the rest of my comments on the actual process of walking through an interview. So there are different stages you have to think about. One is, what do you do before the interview? What do you do during the interview? And then finally, what do you do right after the interview is over? So starting before you even schedule the interview, you want to call the person. If you don't know them, if it's not your Aunt Susie, you want to introduce yourself and tell them a little bit about your project. If you're doing this for more than just your own purposes, share with them what your intentions are for that interview recording and ask if they have any questions for you. You'll also want to spend a little bit of time, a few minutes, just sort of asking, where would, you could either say, I have a suggestion for where we meet. I'd like to set this up at the library in a conference room. Would that be okay with you? Or if it's going to happen maybe in some other place and you're not really sure when you call, if you don't really have a plan, you can ask them where they'd be most comfortable being interviewed. Sometimes for, especially for very elderly people or those who may have mobility issues, they may feel most comfortable in their own home. And so if you're also okay with that, then you'll want to ask them a little bit about the space because you want them to be comfortable, but you also want to ensure that you get a good recording. So it may be that certain parts of the house are not as conducive as others. The ideal is always something like a dining table or a kitchen table, because you can both ideally slide your chair in under the table. You have a good surface where you can set up your mic stand and you can get the right distance and height of the microphone. So those are things to ask. I would also inform them how long you intend to take and be prepared to stick to that as closely as possible. I tend to think that an hour or so is about the right length for a good full oral history interview, but they can vary. And it may be that there's so much to tell that you need to do it in successive days that you arrange. I would also especially make clear that you're recording the interview and that you're going to be asking them to sign a release form. Even when you do, you may find that when you get to the interview and you get out your equipment, they look at you funny and they say, what's that? And you say, oh, well, as I was telling you on the phone, we're going to record the interview. Is that still okay? And usually it is, but sometimes they didn't quite catch that on the phone. So it's good to just sort of be prepared that they may not remember everything that you said on the phone, and you may need to retrace your steps. And so be patient and be prepared for that. You'll also want to keep that initial pre-interview call very short. You don't want them opening up and telling you all these great stories that then you have to try to recapture in an actual interview setting. The worst thing is when someone tells you all these great stories on the phone, and then you can't get them to retell those stories in quite such an interesting way when you actually are doing the interview. And that can create sort of a sense of letdown. And finally, recap what the plan is. What's going to happen next? Are you going to, I like to give them a reminder call or an email or a text or whatever we've agreed on. That gives me peace of mind that we're both going to be there. So I like to say, is it okay for me to follow up with you the day before and confirm? That way you'll feel comfortable. At the interview itself, before you ever hit the record button or tap it on your phone, wherever it is, you need to take some very important things to the interview. Not just your equipment, but it's critically important to have that release form that you told them about. Develop a list of questions, or at least bullet points of things you'd like to cover. I like to do the latter because it gives me more flexibility as opposed to a rigid list of questions, but that's all a matter of personal preference and comfort level. Always have a pen or pencil and paper because you're going to want to jot notes down during the interview. I always want to arrive early as well and test my recording equipment. It helps to familiarize yourself with this, even if you've used it a number of times before. If time has passed since your last use, don't assume that everything's going to come back to you. Test it anyway, and just really be sure that you haven't forgotten a step. When the person you're interviewing arrives, make sure you remind that person of your plans. What's going to happen to this interview? Make sure they're still okay with it, because remember, part of informed consent is, they have rights to what happens, and they may no longer feel comfortable, and they should be able to withdraw from this endeavor at any point, including after you've hit record. They may say, I'm starting to feel uncomfortable. I really don't want to go through with recording this, and I'd like you to destroy the recording. And you should be prepared to say, okay, I'm sorry to hear that, but I'll respect your wishes. Then both of you will sign the form. Remember, it's co-created, so you both need to sign it in order to release that from exclusive rights of either of you. And then finally, place the microphone. I would wait until the person is situated and comfortable, and then I would position the microphone. And I would explain to them that ideally you're trying to keep the same height and distance. And so you'd like them to be comfortable and hopefully not to move around too much, so that you can get a good even recording. Again, 3 to 5 inches from the interviewee's mouth is usually best. If you get much closer than 3 inches, you may go over peak and get distortion if the person laughs, for example, or suddenly speaks in a higher volume. If you get more than 5 inches or so, if you're out at say 10 inches or 12 inches, you begin to lose some of the effectiveness of the microphone, as I had suggested before. Once you're doing the interview, after you hit record, you'll want to give a formal introduction. I like to introduce the date and my name, and then I like to have the person I'm interviewing tell me their name, and you can explain to them in the beginning. Again, I'll use Aunt Susie. If it's Aunt Susie knows who she is, but the public doesn't necessarily know how to spell or pronounce her name. And the pronunciation is a really important thing, because you may have this in a collection where it's spelled out, but if it's maybe an unclear name, it would be nice to know for the record how she pronounces her last name, so that there's no ambiguity. After you introduce, then you begin to go through the basics. I always like to tell people that this is not just your agenda. This is their opportunity to share their story, to craft something themselves. And so I think an oral history is really a balance of whatever your research interest may be, learning about your family, writing a book, doing a community history project, focusing on specific themes in that place. But they may have their own agenda. They may have stories that they've been really eager to tell, and it may not fit always with what you want. So I think it's good to think of an oral history as an opportunity to try to find some balance between giving them room to tell the things they'd like to tell, and also be able to hit the points you'd like to hit. And you may not be necessarily interested in all of the background details, but I think it's better to have them on the record than not to. So I like to ask about, where and when were you born? These days, by the way, I would caution not to, I would actually encourage them not to give you their full birth date, just for identity, preserving your, or securing your identity. It may be a good idea not to give your complete birth date, but maybe you would say, in what year and in what city were you born? And ask them about their childhood experiences, where they lived, maybe what their parents did for a living, what their neighborhood was like, where they went to school. These are important things to have on the record, but there are also ways to get people to open up, because they may be a little bit apprehensive about being recorded. Having this microphone sitting in front of them is a little intimidating sometimes. And so this is a way to get them comfortable by talking about things that they know very well. People usually remember these things, and they don't have to give a lot of deep thought to these types of questions. From there, I like to work toward whatever the focus is. So if, for example, they're a member of some civic club, and that was my original interest in interviewing them, I want to work toward that, but not before I've gotten some of these basics covered. Then I can work toward that. And maybe I'll begin to see some of the influences on those earlier sort of formative events and places in their and people in their lives that help me better understand what I'm actually there thinking I'm there to hear about. It's important to ask effective questions too. We could spend any length of time talking about what effective questions are like, but I'd like to just summarize a couple of examples very quickly. The most important ones that I would toss out are one, to ask simple, straightforward questions rather than multi-part questions. Sometimes we tend to throw 2 or 3 questions together or make some long-winded comment that gradually works its way around to a specific question. That may work in some settings, but it's not the most effective way to engage someone in an oral history interview. So keeping straight to the point and short is really the way to go. If you do have a 3-part question, withhold the second and third parts until you've asked the first part. Consider those follow-up questions rather than part of the question itself. A second example is to avoid what I would call leading questions, questions where you either supply a range of possible responses or you suggest what you think the person should or presumably will say about how they felt about some event in the past. You're trying to be as neutral as possible and to get them to, even if you know them very well, you kind of know they have a certain feeling or sentiment about something, you'd like to just step back and let them say it. Don't inject too much of yourself into it. And finally, I would say try to ask questions that go beyond the basics, things that can be answered in simple yes, no question or yes, no answers. Try to move toward more complex questions that get people to talk about what they thought about something or how they felt, what a place looked like, how it smelled, what a food tasted like, sensory things. And throughout all this, during the interview, the hardest thing, getting back to one thing I said earlier about this is not a conversation so much as a structured interview, the interviewer has to be comfortable with silence. And that can be especially hard on the phone because the way we often show people that we're following them is we say, uh-huh, or yeah, or we may laugh at their joke. But in an oral history interview, whether it's on the phone or in person, you really are trying to not talk over the person you're interviewing. And so you want to ask the question and get out of the way. And if you're in person, you can just give nonverbal gestures. You could smile, you can nod, just don't actually speak. And part of this too, that what's really important about the silence is you need to remind yourself as you're doing this that you don't want to forget to listen. As I say here, listen, listen, listen. Because if you're planning too much and thinking too much about where you're going next in terms of following your list of questions, you can easily forget to listen and you miss cues. You miss opportunities to ask good follow-up questions. And only later when you listen to your recording, do you see where you went wrong. So I like to use my paper to note things that I may want to ask because it frees me up to keep listening. So I'll just jot down a word or two quietly and just keep nodding and smiling and, you know, making eye contact, but letting them speak and then looking for the opportunity to go back and say, you know, a couple of minutes ago, you mentioned this place. Can you, I'm not familiar with that. Can you tell me more about it? And throughout, you're also, assuming it's not a phone interview, you're watching for signs of discomfort or fatigue. Does the person seem like they're worn out? Are they looking at their watch? You know, might they have an appointment that they just remembered? It's okay to pause and say, are you okay? Or do you need a break? Or should we wrap up soon? Rather than to continue and ignore it. working toward the end of an interview, it can be hard sometimes to know how to wrap up an interview, just like it's hard sometimes to know how to wrap up a phone call. And sometimes it can go round and round and never seem to truly wrap up. That can happen in an interview as well. I do want to always be aware of time and read body language, and consider asking if you see that you haven't really covered most or much of what you intended to cover and you're already at an hour. Pause and say, would you be willing to do a follow-up interview if we arranged one? Because I have a lot more questions, and but I also want to respect your time. And when you finally do get to where you've exhausted your questions or reached that point where the interview needs to be called for the day, give your thanks. Ask, before you end the recording, if the interviewee has any final thoughts they'd like to share. A lot of times those are the most profound moments. It's when you say, are there any things we haven't talked about you'd like to share, or do you have any parting thoughts? Sometimes they sort of, as I like to say, put a bow on the package, really sum things up in a way that is more than the sum of the parts that came before. So when you finally do end the interview, the most important thing you could do, it goes without saying, I think, but I need to say it because you can go wrong. Know your equipment, know exactly how you stop the interview. On some things, it's a stop button. On others, you have to hit done. Know what you're doing. Don't just hit what is the pause button and then if it's on an app and walk away, because it may delete your file if you haven't taken the step of actually saving it in whatever the way it works is. So save that file. I don't care how much small talk there is. You want to make sure that you open up a place for yourself to say, okay, I can focus. I may need to ask the person to give me a moment so that I can listen to what they're saying, but I've got to save this file before I do anything else, because that's the most critical thing at the moment. Don't disassemble the equipment, because as I've learned and relearned too many times, if you take the equipment apart too hastily, then inevitably it seems the person said, oh, there was this great story that I forgot to tell you, and oh, you'll love this one. Well, we would love it more if we could get it on the record. And so sometimes you miss opportunities if you take apart your equipment too quickly. So I like to leave things set up as we kind of wind down and maybe are, talking a little after. And you can always say, may I get you on the record saying that? And you can put that together with the previous recording later. So. And I like to, before I leave an interview, I like to let the interviewee know, what are the next steps? Are you going to make an arrangement for how you give them a copy of their recording? Do they want a copy of their release form that they signed? Are you going to let them know when their material is put into a particular collection or when it's used online in a particular way? Are you going, hopefully you're going to transcribe or have the interview transcribed, and you'd probably like to show them the transcript. You may need them to spell some things for you that you missed. Those are the types of next steps that I mean. And then finally, the last thing is what happens after the interview. I've mentioned it before, so I don't need to go into a lot of detail now, but have backup files. It seems redundant, but that's the whole point. Be redundant, because you can't have too many files. It should be a combination of things that are on an actual, like an external hard drive or on a computer at your home. You can burn a CD if you do that. And a lot of people don't have the ability to burn a CD anymore, it seems, but that's a good idea, is to burn a CD, but also have it in the cloud, have it in some trusted service like a Google Drive or iCloud or something. It's always nice to send someone a good old-fashioned thank you letter. Even an email is better than nothing, but thank them again for their time. Tell them how much you enjoyed hearing their stories. And it's also a good opportunity if you're doing it digitally to go ahead and give them a copy of the file. One thing you might not know is that you can transfer a file for free using wetransfer.com. That's what I like to use sometimes for a really large file that's too big to go in an email attachment. It's free to send it, and it gives them a limited period where they can download it, a few days, and then you'd have to resend it if they didn't do it in that time. Keep your release form in a safe place, and I would actually say scan it and keep a PDF with the recording. That way in the future, if you give this to a repository such as CSU or another one, you'll be able to present all of the materials at one time and know where they are. If you can, you should, especially if you're going to deposit this somewhere, arrange to have the interview transcribed, or ask the repository where you're thinking of contributing it if they can help with transcription. So one option, the one that we use these days, is Trent.com. It's not the only one, but it's a artificial intelligence generated rough transcript, basically, that is what the output is after you've uploaded your interview. And then it provides an easy to use web interface that lets you correct the transcript. It does a pretty good job, but it does need some human correction. And it saves some time over transcribing from nothing but the recording. And if appropriate and so inclined, arrange to archive the oral history. Find ideally a library collection, either in a university or a public library, for example. And that way you can know that you can have the peace of mind of knowing that it's not just sitting on your computer. It's somewhere where it will be safeguarded long into the future. And so that really wraps up my initial comments. I'd like to leave some time for questions. And also I'm going to leave this screen up for just a minute before I stop the share, to let you know that there are some resources out there that can answer other questions. The Oral History Association resources page is a good place to look. If you'd like a synopsis of this introduction in different words, I recommend the Baylor University Institute for Oral History, which has a really nice, roughly 20-page oral history manual that has really a lot of the types of things that I've talked about, but it goes into some additional detail and covers some things that I didn't have time to cover. And then finally, the Center for Public History and Digital Humanities, including our oral history collection, is all linked from csudigitalhumanities.org. So I will stop the share and thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Souther, for sharing that with us. And thank you for taking time out of your very busy schedule to join us tonight on this Tuesday night back from Memorial Day. If anybody has any questions at all for Dr. Souther, please feel free to comment them in the chat. I'm just going to take a minute or so just to kind of go over what we have coming up. Just to use this as a little shameless plug for the museum. So we actually have a pretty busy week this week. Thursday night, which is June 3rd at 7 p.m., we have our History of Lower Lake that is going to correspond with our exhibit opening Friday, which is for members only, but I'll get to that in a second. But we have our History of Lower Lake talk, which is going to be done via Zoom. Pre-registration is required. You can find more information on our Facebook page or on our website, which is shakerhistory.org, or just Shaker History on Facebook. And then we have our members only reception for our exhibit opening called A Suburban Oasis. That's the title of our of our temporary exhibit for the summer months, that it is talking all about Lower Lakes and Shaker. And that is free for members, and it is exclusively open to members. And it's going to be an in-person event at the Shaker Historical Museum from 6 to 8 p.m. And that is this Friday night, June 4th. So if anyone is interested in coming to those and you're a member, the members only event is Friday night, and the public event, which is also free, is on Thursday night. So we have a lot of things happening this week for the museum. So there's something for everybody, I think. But if nobody has any other questions, I'm just going to, once again, thank you all for coming. Thank you for being here. And thank you, Dr. Souther, for sharing your time and expertise with us. We greatly appreciate it. And we have another talk from you coming up, which I will also plug now. Lots of things happening. So we actually have, I believe your talk is on the 16th, your first talk. It's a virtual talk again, which is going to be actually broadcasted to our Facebook page. This one was private just to Zoom, but your next talk will be available on June 16th at 6 p.m. And that'll be available through Zoom like we are here and on Facebook Live. And that is titled City Parks and Park Suburbs. So that's going to be a very interesting discussion as well. So make sure not to miss it, everybody. And with that being said, I don't see any other comments or anything. Thank you from Megan. But thank you so much for being here tonight. And I hope that everyone has a wonderful rest of your evening and a wonderful rest of your week. And hopefully we get to see you at the museum sometime soon.
Thanks so much.
Thank you and have a good night, everyone.